All right, thank you very much. My name is Howard White. I'm the publisher of Harbour Publishing, and I'm honored to have been asked to be the MC here tonight. We're here to launch the final, and I think one of the finest books by the great Canadian poet, Patrick Lane. It's this wonderful book here called The Quiet in Me. It's certainly one of the most beautiful books that Pat ever had published, thanks to this gorgeous cover design by Rhonda Ganz, who's going to be with us tonight and doing a reading. So our agenda here tonight will be that I'm going to say a few words about my own acquaintance with Patrick. We're then going to have some readings by Lorna and several other writers and Patrick's two sons, Michael and Richard. And then we'll put the session open for questions. I'm phoning in here from the traditional territory of the Seashell Nation. And I'm supposed to now give an anti-harassment statement, but and Nicole, our excellent planner from ZG Stories, who put this evening together with the help of Munro's Books in Victoria, who will be selling Patrick's books later. But you know, I don't have it written down here. I've forgotten the actual words, but ZG Stories asks that everyone create a respectful and kind environment here for this event. Okay, so Patrick is one of the hundreds of writers I've published over my 50-odd years in publishing. He's one of the few writers that I actually knew more as a person than a writer. When I think of him, I think of the guy I knew and the guy I hung out with more than I think of as the manuscripts that I edited and published, which is it's a rarity in my experience, but it just goes back to the early 70s. I think it was 1974 when I first met Patrick. He was he'd already published several books by that time, and he was a bit known in the Canadian writing business. And I remember Peter Trower, who was a writer I just published in Gibson's and was very eager to get known and make the scene, told me that Patrick was going to be reading in Vancouver. We should go in and meet this up and coming Canadian writer. So we did. I wasn't quite as keen about kind of bird dogging well-known writers as Pete was. I was afraid of sort of seeming like a bit of a groupie, but that didn't bother Pete. And he went right up to Pat after the reading, invited him down to that great crossroads of literary events in BC, the Cecil Hotel Bar, and we passed a very enjoyable evening getting to know Pat. And wasn't too long after that, we kept in touch over one thing and another. Pat decided to move up to the Sunshine Coast, to Pender Harbour, where I was just starting my Harbour Publishing printing plant and publishing operation. I don't think it was just because of that he moved there. But through his acquaintance with me, he got to realize it was actually a very pleasant place to be, fairly close into Vancouver. So he moved up, and shortly after that brought in his then partner Carol, and they bought a little house in Middle Point on 10 acres and set up housekeeping, and I forget if that was where Michael was born. Michael, were you born on the Sunshine Coast, or?
No, I was born in Vernon, but
Right,
I think we were at the Sunshine Coast within my first year.
Yeah, you were pretty small. And Richard, you were born on the Sunshine Coast, I think. So for the next 4 or 5 years, Pat was a Sunshine Coast person, and I got to know him, and we got to be buddies. We cut wood together, fished and hunted together, shot pool, drank together, and just got to be good friends, and we kept that friendship up over all of the years until his passing. So people often ask me what Pat was like, and the assumption is, given the serious nature of most of his writing and sometimes dark and even horrific qualities of it, you might be forgiven for assuming that he would be a gloomy sort of a guy, and you'd be dead wrong. In my experience, at least, Pat was generally a cheerful, easygoing guy, always up for a beer, a hand of poker, some stories. He was an enthusiastic teller of stories about his youthful mayhem and horrors of the workplace when he was working in the forest industry and the sawmill industry. And his stories were often so wild that I think most people around the room thought they were highly exaggerated. Although it's odd, in the few cases where I've ever been able to check up on any of them, I found out they were actually completely true. Unlike a lot of writers, especially poets, Pat was very good with his hands. He could strip down a Briggs and Stratton engine and get it back together again so it worked. And when he first came to Pender Harbor, he wasn't much of a carpenter, but he bought his own house and he started making repairs and pounding together rough wood window boxes and slamming together some rough back steps. And that became sort of his way of making a few bucks. And so soon he was hiring out as a kind of a handyman and making more sort of back steps and porches and things. And by God, within 2 years, he was building complete houses. He was hanging the doors, he was laying tile, he was installing cabinets, finishing the whole bit. I mean, I could never have done it. I've spent my whole life trying to get along with wood, and I still bend over every second nail. But Patrick was turning in very professionally built houses after just a few years. And that impressed the hell out of me. I knew tons of writers that could barely tie their own shoes. And I was just so impressed that he was such a capable guy. He was truly a man of many parts. But as well as I knew him, I was always sort of mystified about where the writing came from. When he wrote some of those just unbelievably beautiful lines about, lost loves and just trying to come to terms with the disappointments of life and the meaning of the universe. I just had no idea where that came from. It just didn't seem to match the sort of beer drinking, wood splitting, poker bluffing guy I knew. It made me realize how much lay deep inside. I remember one time getting what I thought might be a glimpse of his artistic being. A bunch of us would-be writers were trading gossip over some beers, and one happened to mention that a different writer who wasn't there, and was quite a good writer, quite a good poet, had enrolled in law school so that he would have an independent income to fall back on. And it was strange. Pat just reacted with surprising vehemence. He pounded his fist on the table and he said, "That's bullshit. If you're going to write, there can be no safety net. Every time I write a line, I'm gambling everything I have, my house, my car, my family, my life. Everything's on the line. That's the way it has to be. Art can't have a safety net." Well, I thought he'd had too many beers at the time, but later I realized he meant it. Not long after saying that, he packed in the cozy little scene in Pender Harbor and hit the road again. But when he said he put it all on the line in his writing, he didn't mean just gambling with the externals of life. He meant he put the whole question of living on the line. No matter how a Pat Lane poem starts, it always ends up in a battle to the death with the question of, what are we doing here? To be or not to be? That's him every time out. He can't be frivolous in a poem. The poem was his battleground where he battled with the question of whether or not to go on. And death was always a presence in his writing, whether it was on center stage or off in the wings, but you could hear it breathing heavily. That's why I was so intrigued and also a bit alarmed when Lorna told me that he'd written this final book during his long and dreadful final disease, when death was no longer a vision, but a reality right there in the room with him. I was preparing for the worst, but to my surprise, I find this final book relaxed about the whole question of existence and its end. I think it's some of the most mellow and peaceful writing that Pat ever did. Final thoughts on the matter by a man who's struggled mightily with his demons and come to a peaceful accommodation with them at last. I think you'll agree when you hear the writers that I'm going to introduce now read some excerpts from this book. I think we'll, I have an agenda here. We'll start with Stephen Price. Stephen is going to read a poem called Slick. Stephen, as most will know, is a very distinguished BC novelist. He's written By Gaslight, which was longlisted for this Giller Prize, and Into the Darkness. He's also a very accomplished poet in his own right, and he's written 2 award-winning poetry books, Anatomy of Keys, winner of the Gerald Lampert Award, and Omens in the Year of the Ox, winner of the Relit Award. So Stephen, you're on.
Thank you, Howie. It's such a pleasure to be here. Howie, everything you said about Patrick was so moving and true to the man that I knew as well. Although I came into Patrick's life at a different point. I was 19 years old and I had enrolled in the writing program at the University of Victoria, and I knew nothing about poetry. I thought poetry rhymed. I thought that it was about clouds and daffodils. And I thought that it had to be written by dead white men. And so when I enrolled in that first year poetry course and had Patrick Lane walk into the room, I knew I was in trouble. And he terrified me and electrified me in equal measure. Patrick went on to be my teacher for several more years at the University of Victoria, my mentor, and eventually my friend. And I can say with the utmost clarity in my heart that he is not only one of the finest poets our country's ever seen, but he's one of the finest human beings that I've ever known. He was a remarkable man. And, it's hard for me to grapple, I think, a little bit with the fact that he's gone, and yet he left us these beautiful, powerful poems. There's such an acceptance, such a calmness, I think, as Howie was saying in this final book. And for me, it's some of the work that I know I'll be returning to of his for the rest of my life. I wanted to read to you this poem, Slick, in which Patrick revisits a recollection, a memory of his father. And for those of you who know Patrick, and I know there's a lot of familiar faces here, who knew Patrick, he wrote a fair bit about his father and the complicated relationship he had with him. And yet in this last poem, this late poem about his father, you can see that he's finding a kind of, he's making a kind of peace, I think, with that relationship. Slick. My father laid his blade, slick, 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 upon my arm. The fine hair falling, whispers in the oil. Steel dust glittered on my skin, my arm a sky at night. I understand what he taught me only now. A blade is a sigh. A trout caught in the mountains, the flight of willow leaves. They move in the wind without number. How hard it is to remember, I forget. To forget, I remember. My scar is only one of my father's teachings. Listen, the trout remains in shadow as the creek passes by. The fallen leaf gets to shore by walking on water. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That was wonderful. We'll now go to Rhonda Ganz. Rhonda lives in Victoria. She's a graphic designer, and you can see an excellent sample of her work on the beautiful cover of this book. Rhonda is in addition to being a talented designer, is a poet in her own right, and has been published in many magazines and anthologies. So Rhonda is going to read to us now a poem called The Elder Tree. Rhonda?
Thanks, Howie. I wouldn't be a poet if it weren't for Patrick Lane and also Lorna. I think of them as a package usually, but it was Patrick that I got to know first, and Patrick was my first teacher, and Lorna afterwards. And I don't know what I would have done without finding the poetry community in Victoria. And he, for me, was certainly my introduction to it. And I remember saying to him once that poetry saved my life, and he immediately knew what that meant, and I didn't have to explain it. And so I think having somebody as a teacher who understood that and helped guide me to a place of poetry and finding those words to say things, I can't express my gratitude enough for that. I chose this poem because I knew about this tree in the forest near where Patrick lives that he went to. That was his higher being. I'm not sure what the term is, but rather than God, this is where he would go to be spiritual and to pray. And I was there once on a walk with him and somebody else, and he was like, "Oh, I think I'll show you my tree today." So we went down to Coles Bay and we puttered around the bay. And as we were heading back, he goes, "No, not today. I'm not going to share my tree with you today." So I still don't know where the tree is. I know maybe at some point in my life I will find the tree, but it doesn't matter if I never see it. I know it's there. And I know it was something that he went to every day and was really important to him. The elder tree. Today I cleared the earth around the elder tree, moved the dead branches the wind had carried to where I come to pray. And today the turtle rose from the pond's heavy dark to heal her winter shell. She rises in the spring when the light returns. I leaned against the ancient bark, closed my eyes, and saw my father planting trees, his hands caring for the roots. How long ago the fathers, their stories, another kind of cure. The sun mends most wounds. Each prayer I say beneath the tree, the oldest prayer. Her branches in the wind sing to me. I am the tree who rests on the back of the turtle rests upon.
Lovely. Thank you, Rhonda. We're now going to hear from Esi Edugyan. Essie is a well-known novelist, as I'm sure everyone here realizes. Something I didn't realize is that she's a graduate of Johns Hopkins University. I've always been puzzled by that name. Why is it called Johns Hopkins? Why not just John Hopkins? Anyway, Essie was raised in Calgary, Alberta, and she's written a number now of incredibly excellent and very, very well received novels, Half-Blood Blues, Dreaming of Elsewhere, and Washington Black, which was shortlisted for the Man Booker Award and won the 2018 Giller Prize. So Essie, what are you going to read for us tonight?
Hi, Howard. Thank you for that. I'm going to read Icebergs off Cogo Island, but I just wanted to start by saying a few words about Patrick, who was my first teacher when I arrived at the University of Victoria at the age of 17. I'd originally gone to study journalism, and such was Patrick's magnetism that he lured me into studying poetry, and I just got lost in this whole world of prose and poetry and fiction, and never returned to journalism, much to my...
And it's a good thing.
But he was just, one of the most insightful and generous teachers that I ever had in all of my schooling. And, that generosity was something that really informed our later friendship. He and Lorna just became these huge mentors for Stephen and I. And, we wouldn't be the writers that we are today without that, their careful eyes and just the generosity of spirit. I remember returning to campus in second year after my mother had suddenly passed away. And Patrick was like the first person I ran into in the writing department when I returned. And, he didn't say anything. He just kind of gathered me in his arms into this great bear hug. And I felt, just so cared for in that moment. And for me, that gesture just really sums up who he was as a man. He's so missed. So I'm going to read Icebergs off Cogo Island, and I chose it simply because I thought it was so beautiful. It is the quiet we love, the way the water touches us, the iceberg, an animal gone astray in search of time. The water that is ice is 10,000 years old. The sea slides across its shine, caresses the frozen curves, the arabesques of blue and green and white. The rocks off Joe Bat's arm speak silently of snow, the wind that wears them away. Each wave brings water back to water, as if the iceberg is a child come home and, found at last, melts into the arms of its mother. So thank you.
Thank you, Essie. That was lovely. Okay, we're now going to hear from Patrick's son, Michael Lane, who, as he mentioned earlier, was born in Vancouver, but moved to Pender Harbour when he was only 1. And I remember him as a little boy growing up there, full of mischief and full of questions. And in fact, his questions were so amazing that his uncle, John Lane, just copied them down and broke them into poetry lines. And we published them as a book of poems called What Are Uncles For? And it was illustrated by my son, Silas. So I still have a few copies of that book, which I cherish greatly, and I still get a great kick out of it. Michael, what are you going to read tonight?
I'm going to read a poem called Om. Thanks for bringing up that book. I have a copy of it as well that I read to the kids, and they really appreciate my insights into Spider-Man and my little brother peeing the bed. So I'm sure Richard will appreciate me sharing that part of the book. The poem I'm reading tonight is Om, and I want to get through the poem first before I say anything else. So, Om. How thin the night, a mole's cry waking me. In dream, my ear was to the dark, an earthworm in its tunnel waiting. I feel my brittle bones and smile. I am as fragile as winter grass. I think of leaping to the floor and don't. Like my old cat, I climb down slowly, accept the smile of my woman who gives me coffee in the morning. She makes me want to remember when we moved naked in a summer far away. How sweet our laughter on the gray stones touching. And so the prince set out on the road to discover suffering and gave himself up at the last. Thinking won't get me there either. My work is always close at hand. The cat purrs and offers me his prey. A headless mole, his fur the color of the moon. So,
Very nice.
thanks. I chose that poem because it's him in his in his last days. And I still remember him there with his brittle bones in a luxurious bathrobe, climbing down slowly from chairs and beds and down steps. And so this poem makes me think of him then. And it's an important one for me. So I'm really happy I got the chance to read it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was excellent. Michael's done. We're now going to call on Patrick's other son, Richard. Richard, you're on.
Hi. Yeah, I think Mike's going to be really happy that I came on after him so that I get the last word on the embarrassing stories, which I probably won't share. I had a relationship with my dad that didn't really stretch too deeply into poetry, which is funny. I think we sort of gave each other what we both wanted from each other, which was just a father and a son. I remember talking to somebody and then saying like, "Oh, you must have these great conversations with your dad about poetry and writing and creativity." And we talked more about football and trucks and arguments about pneumatic hammers versus actually wielding a hammer. He never used an air hammer once in his life. I tried to get him to one day when we were up there building a shed or working on a shed together, but he was a purist. He was a pure carpenter at heart. And so that was it. It was interesting. After he passed away, I thought I should start reading a lot more of his poetry because I feel like I missed a large part of it by not being a student of his or a writer. And so his collected works, this tome, I read through the entire thing in about a month and a half. And there's some good poetry in there.
You bet there is.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to read Hummingbirds from his new book, and then there's a short excerpt from a poem that actually is from the same time we've been talking about Howie. It's from his new and selected in 1978, which was at the Pender Harbour years when we were a family. So I'm going to start with Hummingbirds. They say you can pluck them like jewels from the branches at night, if you can find them sleeping inside the shivering bamboo. How many nights have I tried and failed, full moon and crescent, the dark and the light? I have searched in the black bamboo and the gold, but who can find such a small heart? And we did talk about hummingbirds a lot. He used to think they were sort of these spirits, these free will-o'-the-wisps that would fly around the garden a lot. And it was like wherever him and Lorna lived, and I'm sure they had one in Pender Harbour, they always had hummingbird feeders, and they would flock around there. So the other poem I'm going to read is called Wild Birds, an excerpt from it. And because I can picture him in the poem, I can picture where he's writing the poem, I can picture him out there. It really means a lot to me. It's a vivid image in my brain. Once beyond the sight of land, I saw a flock of crows battle the wind. Baffled, returning, knowing the landfall, they beat their wings against a strength greater than their own. We are all of us as those birds I saw at sea, blown outwards against our will. I read the books and dreamed the dream that words would change the vision, make of man a perfect animal, and so transformed become immortal. What else was there to dream? Not this beating against the wind. Chaos is our creation, and the God we wished was man. To turn again into the thing we are, yet be black cinders lost at sea, the wild birds failing. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Pat had a thing about birds. I bet if he wrote 1,000 poems, there were birds in 300 of them. Now we're going to go to Lorna Crozier. Needs no introduction, but I'll give her one anyway. She's the author of a beautiful memoir of her life with Patrick, Through the Garden, which was a finalist for the Hillary Weston Writers' Trust Prize. She's published 18 books of poetry, only 18. I thought it was twice that, but that's because they were all so excellent. She's the author of the Book of Marvels, a compendium of everyday things, and the memoir Small Beneath the Sky, which won the Hubert Evans Award for Creative Nonfiction. She won the Governor General's Award for Poetry for Inventing the Hawk, and 3 additional collections were also finalists for the GG. She's also received the Canadian Authors Award, 3 Pat Lowther Memorial Awards, and the Raymond Souster Award, among many other accolades, including the Order of Canada. So Lorna, you're on.
Thanks, Howie. I don't know why I agreed to go last, because it's so emotional listening to everyone and these wonderful memories about the amazing Patrick Lane. He loved all of you who are reading tonight with his big and open heart. And so moving to hear that for everyone tonight except Howie, he was your first teacher, and how important that is, your first teacher, and how great that it was he. And I remember him talking about all of you with such admiration and affection, and of course, with such love, and his love for his sons, Michael and Richard. I was the one who wrote the dedication for the book. Patrick and I did not have a chance to talk about this coming out as a book. He gave me a folder of poems a few months before he died and said, I think I have a book here and I'd be interested in what you think. And as we had done for the almost 40 years of our relationship, I read the pages and I made a few editing notes, mostly writing wonderful in the margin. But he never got well enough to go back and look at my suggestions and either make changes or keep them the same. And we were always very respectful. We never pressured each other to make a change that the editor in us thought was right. We would just make a comment and leave it up to the writer to decide whether to follow the advice or say, screw this, I like the way it is. But of course, Patrick wasn't here when I edited this manuscript. So I had to make the decisions and just pray that I was making the right ones. I had to, in a way, channel him and say, look, is this okay, Patrick? If I take out this line, or if I change this adjective, or if I delete this poem entirely from the manuscript, if I include a few that were not in the original folder, because I discovered a few others and a couple of people sent me poems that he had written that I hadn't seen before. So I wanted to do well by him.
You did, Lorna. You did a beautiful job. I'm so grateful that you were there to put the refinements on this manuscript.
Thank you, Howie. So I also had to decide who to dedicate the book to. And so it is dedicated to Patrick Lane's children and grandchildren, for his beloved students, and for his lifelong friend and poetry publisher, Howie White. And of course, I knew there was no one else to send this small manuscript to other than Howie. It was the wrap up, the last note in the long symphony of poetry publishing the two had together. And Patrick could have taken his books to other publishers, but he didn't, because he loved Howie and he believed in Harbour and what Howie was doing. And he believed, as much as anyone I know, in the value of the local, that you write from who you are. You write about the people you knew and know. You write the local using the images and details from what's around you. And you also remain true to the local publisher, because they are what keeps this country going in terms of our literature and the richness of our poetry and prose. And no one's done that better or with a bigger heart than Howard White. So I'm going to try to get through 3 poems. We'll see how it goes. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. It's just, my heart is close to breaking. Maybe I'll read 2 poems. Just chickened out of one. Kintsugi. Kintsugi, Patrick says in a note at the bottom of the poem, means golden repair. And it's the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery by mixing lacquer with powdered gold. The repair of a broken bowl is only one of its many possible beauties. And I think Patrick would be the first to tell you that his life had many cracks in it, many breaks. And his golden repair was poetry. Kintsugi. The raccoon washes with slender fingers a broken moon. Fog forms dew on my face, and I weep without intent. Over the waters, the crippled cedars hang in the remains of storms. Their branches reach now for the sea. Like the raccoon, I am distracted by the task at hand. As now, the scars without my body greater than the scars within. Bones shine through my skin. Tonight I cradled my woman as she slept the night. Such peace. I am outside myself without disguise. There is only a little left to know. Water returns to water. The dew in my eyes, a moment ago, an ocean. On the face of the golden puddle, the moon repairs itself again, and yet again. And now the smallest poem in the book, I think. Carefully. The mole in his small room moves a small stone and waits out the rain. I'll read that again because I believe we had a dog chorus. Carefully. The mole in his small room moves a small stone and waits out the rain. I think Patrick would be delighted that these last words are moving out in the world 3 years after his death. He died on March the 7th, 3 years ago. And it pleases me so much to think that wherever he is, he feels us, bringing in his voice and his words into our bodies and our hearts once again. And this is for him.
Thank you, Lorna. That was beautiful. Well, I'm going to depart from the script here. Lorna had it in her list to read the title poem of the book, The Quiet in Me. And I suspect that she omitted it because it might have been hard for her to get through. So I'm going to try and get through it. It might be hard for me too. This is The Quiet in Me. And I think it's right that it's the title poem of this book because it sums up everything that Patrick wanted to say and leave us with. There is a quiet in me. The old man I lifted today from the pavement, his weight beyond being, his legs useless, his wheelchair a step away, and he was like some warrior fallen from his horse, his tank, his life. Staggering, I danced with him, his muscled arms in mine, his legs moving like the empty wings of a bird just dead. And I was suddenly back there in that cabin in the north, lifting a body to bed, and dead, and dead. The weight of him, an old man, all parchment skin and rickets, all what? The body newly dead falls, limber as tired rubber, heavy as the world. How long ago now since I laid the old prospector, my friend, on his cot and covered him, not out of shame, but as I might have covered a woman sleeping after love. And so too this fallen man I lifted from the parking lot, his wife wringing her hands, the sound of her skin whispering, and thank you, she said. The man grinning up at me from his chair as he settled his legs and done, wheeled himself away, leaving me with his muscles still in my hands. And two, the other man, my friend, dead now these many years, who fought in the Boer War and who rode the rails with the unemployed and homeless to Regina, having washed his flesh clean of poverty, having dressed him and covered him with earth. The lovers too I laid to rest, and the sleep that follows love. All the arms I've held, such arms as will hold me. Thank you. We're now going to move on to the questions. I'm looking at the chat here, and I'm not seeing a lot of questions, but you know what? I don't see anybody. I'm just talking to myself here. If those people who are comfortable with having their face on a screen that may be publicly recorded at some time, I wish you'd click yourselves on so we could all see each other and all be together in this celebration of this wonderful writer, Patrick. There you all are. That's wonderful. That's great. Now, what I like to do in my Zoom readings, it's very scary, but it sometimes works, and that is to urge everybody to actually activate their mics so that we're all in the room and we can all hear each other chuckling and gasping and breathing. So why don't you just do that? Let's have some questions. You can ask me or any of the people who read or anybody else that you see on the screen. Carol, your mic is off. Were you asking a question? You're still muted. You need to unmute yourself. It's down there in the lowest left-hand corner of your screen.
Yeah.
There you are. I can hear you now.
No
Carol,
questions.
did you have a question?
No, thank you.
Oh, okay. I thought you were, I could see your lips moving. I thought you were asking a question. Let's see, Nicole, do you see any questions in the chat? I don't see an actual question there.
Well, they're only
I think
doing.
Nicole had a question.
Nicole, do you have a question?
Yes, I do actually. Lorna, can you speak a little bit about the flow and order of the poems in the book and what guided you through the decisions of what poem to put where?
Sure. I hate to answer that question because the answer is so simple and untechnical. I decided what poem was going to open the book, and I decided what poem was going to close the book. And then I laid the rest on the floor in the living room, and I went and said, you know, this poem wants to nuzzle against this one, and this poem would like to be beside this one. And wait a minute, that poem doesn't want to sit there. And I just intuitively moved them around. And then, of course, read them again when I had a tentative order to see if the right notes were being struck at the right time. It's the way I arranged my own manuscripts. So I brought that same intuition to Patrick's work, but he didn't have an order when he gave it to me. I mean, it was just in a stack of papers, and I knew he hadn't thought that through. So that fell back on my shoulders, and I hope I made the right decisions.
Did any of the poems give you any particular trouble when you were trying to place them?
Place them in order? No. I mean, some of the poems gave me particular trouble when I had to read through them. When I first read the work that he gave me, I don't know if I was in denial or not, but neither of us knew he was dying. We thought there might be a diagnosis, and he might, if not get a cure, at least a treatment that would have prolonged his life. Maybe he knew in his heart he was on his way out, but he didn't want to tell me because he was worried about me. And when I read them the first time, I didn't see that shadow of mortality cast on the pages. But when I started editing them, I definitely felt the presence of his death. And maybe he did too. But I've always believed that poems know before we do what our future is going to be. And in this case, I really had that feeling. So some of those poems were hard for me to go into because it brought the grief back so palpably. And because I had to be with him 100% in his mind and in his body and in his heart to try to make the best of these poems. I couldn't have him at arm's length. I had to go right back into his wonderful and brilliant presence to get the poems to where they are. And that's not to say that I made dozens and dozens of changes. I didn't, but I made some. And I had to bring his presence into my room where I was doing this in order to make it happen. That was the difficult part. The rest, not so. And as I said, I knew what publisher to send them to, and so on.
Thank you so much for that, Lorna.
And I have to say, when we got the book, we didn't change a comma. It was perfect. Any other questions? Nicole or Ryan, there's several people saying that their cameras seem to be turned off and they can't get on the screen. I don't know if that's anything we can address. That's nothing I have any control over.
Thanks for your patience, everyone. We should all be able to turn cameras on now. If you have any additional problems, send us a message and we'll get it sorted.
Okay. All right. Must be a few more questions out there.
It looks like Annie raised her hand.
I don't have a question. I have a comment that I just this week finished reading your book, Lorna, about Patrick's last 2 years, and it moved me so deeply. Thank you for writing it. It's hard. I can't imagine how you managed to do that. But I also had the chance to see Patrick at a reading once in Victoria some years ago, and it was such a beautiful evening. I took my husband, who very rarely reads poetry and has just said to me now he finds it so difficult. And I said, well, let's just start reading more of it. We'll start reading more of it together. So thank you. And I'm happy to meet the two sons who also show up in your book.
Yeah, thank you, Anne.
This is such a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. And I think it's a wonderful idea that you and your husband read poems out loud to one another. I think it's going to be very romantic as well.
Yes. After 50 years of marriage, I guess so, eh? Thank you very much.
Okay. Great to see so many familiar faces out there. Do we have any?
Their hands up.
Okay, two participants raised hands, but where do I, why don't you just speak up. I'm not sure how to turn you on.
Hi, it's Wally Du Temple here, a neighbor of Lorna, and I just want hi. It's been a wonderful evening, fantastic, and I so much love that on Earth Day, the love of nature, the feeling of being part of the land, and almost an indigenous presence of being all one comes through the poetry. And thank you, Lorna, for and Howard White for Howie White for giving us this wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Wally, for bringing up that it was Earth Day, because I know of no one being close to nature, its flora and fauna, than Patrick was. And he suffered greatly for the climate catastrophe we're going through right now. And his poems for me are kind of an anodyne to the wreckage we're doing in the world. He was a pagan, really, at heart. And the poem that Rhonda read, there is a big tree across from us in Coles Bay Park, and it was his higher power. He was a member of AA for the last 20 years of his life. And when it was mentioned that you should turn your life over to a higher power, you should talk to a higher power, the God of your understanding. The God of Patrick's understanding was an old tree.
It's great. Thank you.
Yeah, makes good sense. We have a question from Sheila for Essie, Stephen, or Rhonda. What does it mean to you to have this last book from your teacher? Pretty open question.
Essie, Rhonda, would you guys like to take this first?
Okay, I'll try to say something. I was lucky enough to hear him read so many times that one of the best gifts I have, and it's true about every poet, I think, who you actually hear read, when you read the written word, you hear their voice. And you can see them in front of a podium, and Patrick spoke with his hands. So for me, reading the words on the page, I can see him reading and hear him reading. And I think that for me, 3 years later, was just the best part about this book.
Thank you, Rhonda. Essie or Stephen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, he was my teacher first, but over the years he became my friend, and I'm sure it's true of Essie too. So for me, it's more of a book from a mentor or a friend at this point, and it's interesting that it's impossible to separate. When he was my teacher and I was starting out, there was the man and then there was the poetry. And the more you got to know Patrick, the more you understood that the two were one. And it's impossible for me to read these poems without hearing his voice and without feeling like I am getting a last glimpse into his presence here on Earth. So it reads to me in some ways like a kind of gift that you get to carry forward into the future. It's moving on a personal, in a personal way, of course, and in the private way of grief. But it's also
Price
rejuvenating for me as a writer to get to read these poems and be reminded again why we're doing what we're doing, which is what Patrick, every time I would meet him, that's what he reminded me of. Yeah.
Thank you. That was great. Essie, did you want to add to that? Muted.
You know, Stephen and I went over to see Lorna shortly after Patrick had passed. And I just remember she, you know, led us into his study, and there was, you know, there were these poems on his desk in a folder. And do you remember that feeling of astonishment, Steve? Like we had just lost him. And yet here was this, you know, here was his voice still living, and something that we would be able to, you know, this piece of him that we would still be able to hear, you know, in the future when, you know, when Lorna was open to sharing them. And we were just filled with astonishment. I think we even sort of gasped that there was this new manuscript, you know, sitting in his office. Yeah, it's that sort of maybe living piece, you know, his word still living, that we, you know, we took a lot of comfort from that, and still do.
Yeah, you know, I might also add, Patrick and Lorna, they represented something more than just two generous, brilliant, beautiful writers and people. For Essie and me in particular, you know, when we were young students, and Essie and I met shortly after we first became Patrick and Lorna's students, and we've been together ever since. But you know, at the time when you're a young writer and you're 19 or 20 or 21, there's this myth of the writer where, you know, two writers, if they get together, it's going to be a terrible disaster. And you know, the romantic myth is how the relationship unravels and is obliterated by envy and jealousy and sourness. And Patrick and Lorna showed us that it was possible for two writers to love each other and believe in each other and feel joy at each other's achievements and put the other one first without sacrificing their own artistic path. And it's almost impossible for me, and I think Essie feels the same way, to imagine finding that at such a young age somewhere else if we didn't have them in our lives living it daily in front of us. So that was you know, it's this extra great gift that isn't always acknowledged when we find ourselves talking about the poetry itself. And I think it has something to do with the vast and generous humanity of the two people. If I'm not embarrassing you too much, Lorna.
No, you're just moving me very, very much. Thank you so much, Stephen.
You want to know, sorry, Esi, when you're saying how, you know, this is another glimpse of getting his voice again and things like that, from a practical standpoint, because we heard him, my wife and I, my brother as well, we heard him read so many times that there really is a practical standpoint to it. Because when I read his poetry, I hear his voice, because I read it like he read it. And so if I ever need to hear his voice again, I can just read his poetry because it's there. It's a completely different voice than his normal everyday life, but it's almost like, you know, finding an old message on an answering machine of his, and you can listen to it over and over again. So it's a really neat time capsule almost of him. I hope to never lose it.
No, that's one great thing about writing is it doesn't fade away. We're going to be able to look back at this book and his other great books now and forever. And every time we do, those of us who knew him will hear that voice, and he will be there in the room with us. I had very much the same experience. I wasn't with him as much as I wished I had been during his last few years. And I did go over to see him quite near the end, but he was so weak by then that he could only speak for about 10 minutes. But he was still the cheerful, bright, wonderful Patrick. But he could only do it for a little while, and then he had to totter off to bed. And I really felt that I'd missed out on a very important part of our relationship. But reading this book, I'm able to actually visit him during that whole period and be a part of what he was thinking and going through. And you know, I was, you know, worried about the pain he was going through and you know, what his spirits must be like. But reading this book, his mind was good. These are great poems. This is an excellent book. He was able to do the thing that he was born to do and do it well right up to the very last minute. And there's something wonderfully reassuring about that. So that's our time. We're over time. And I'd like to thank all our readers. I'd like to thank Munro's Books for being a sponsor of this event, and ZG Stories for putting it all together. And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. It's been wonderful to share the evening with you and see your friendly faces out there and know that the world is still full of poetry lovers. So thank you very much. And on behalf of all of us at Harbour Publishing and all our readers, I'd like to bid you good night.